Canada's outgoing ambassador to the United States just confirmed what strategic analysts have been documenting for years. The deliberate pressure campaign Donald Trump executed against Canada, one of America's most reliable allies, failed completely. Not only did it fail to extract concessions, it permanently restructured the relationship in ways that reduce American influence and strengthen Canadian independence. Ambassador Kirsten Hillman stated publicly that Canada will never return to the old model of automatic cooperation with the United States. And she said that's not necessarily a bad thing. Trump's pressure toolkit against Canada, steel and aluminum tariffs justified through fabricated national security arguments, threats to terminate trade agreements, public rhetoric questioning Canadian sovereignty, and suggesting Canada become America's 51st state. Centralized decision-making that bypassed diplomatic institutions. Unpredictable policy announcements designed to create uncertainty, hostile language targeting Canadian leaders personally, economic coercion framed as negotiating strategy. Trump imposed these measures thinking he would force Canadian compliance. He believed Canada's geographic position, economic integration, and political restraint meant it would absorb disruption quietly to preserve stability. Instead, Canada hardened its position, reduced its exposure to American volatility, diversified its trade partnerships, strengthened domestic industries, and built institutional resilience that no longer assumes U.S. political stability is guaranteed. The relationship didn't deteriorate by accident. It was deliberately weaponized by Washington, and Canada responded by becoming less dependent, not more compliant. This isn't theory, this is happening right now. Ambassador Hillman confirmed Canada's focus is now on long-term self-reliance and diversification away from automatic U.S. alignment. American businesses warned Trump repeatedly that confronting Canada would damage the U.S. economy. They explained integrated supply chains, higher input costs, reduced competitiveness. Those warnings were ignored. Political theater was prioritized over economic reality. And American industries absorbed the losses, while Canada adjusted. Today, we're showing you how Trump's pressure strategy against Canada backfired completely. How his tariffs and threats strengthened Canadian independence instead of weakening it. How American businesses became collateral damage in his failed campaign, and how Canada permanently repositioned itself for a post-automatic cooperation era. This is the story of a strategic miscalculation that weakened American influence while hardening Canadian resolve. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with what Donald Trump actually did to Canada and why Ambassador Hillman's confirmation matters. Trump imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada in 2018, justified through Section 232 national security provisions. Canada, one of America's most reliable suppliers of both metals, was suddenly classified as a security threat. Steel faced 25% tariffs. Aluminum faced 10% tariffs. These weren't symbolic. These were designed to raise costs, create uncertainty, generate political pressure inside Canada, and disrupt integrated North American industries that had operated for decades on the assumption of stable access. But Trump didn't stop there. He repeatedly used language that undermined Canada's sovereignty. Remarks suggesting Canada could become America's 51st state were not diplomatic errors. They were deliberate signals. Signals that Canada's independence could be questioned. Signals that power asymmetry would be emphasized. Signals that respect was conditional. This rhetoric was designed to weaken Canada's negotiating position by reframing the relationship psychologically. Make the smaller partner feel subordinate. Make them doubt their autonomy. Make them accept terms they wouldn't otherwise consider. Ambassador Hillman revealed how Trump centralized trade decision-making to maximize unpredictability. She stated publicly that under Trump, policy became shaped primarily by one individual rather than institutions. This allowed pressure tactics to be deployed rapidly without bureaucratic restraint. Tariffs could be announced overnight through Twitter. Threats could be issued publicly without diplomatic preparation. Negotiations could be reframed through social media rather than formal channels. Canada was forced to respond not to predictable institutional processes, but to political impulses. This asymmetry was intentional. Trump also escalated hostile rhetoric targeting Canadian leaders personally. He attacked Prime Minister Justin Trudeau publicly. He walked out of meetings. He withdrew endorsements of joint statements. Every province with steel or aluminum production felt immediate pressure. Ontario manufacturers faced higher export costs. Quebec aluminum producers lost competitiveness in U.S. markets. British Columbia steel fabricators saw orders cancelled. The prairies watched agricultural equipment costs rise because of metal tariffs. Every region with cross-border economic ties absorbed disruption simultaneously. The mathematical result is simple. Tariffs raised costs for integrated industries, plus unpredictable policy created investment uncertainty, plus hostile rhetoric damaged diplomatic trust, plus centralized decision-making eliminated institutional stability. Trump acknowledged these tools hurt Canada, but he believed the pain would force compliance. He believed Canada's geographic position meant it had no alternative to American markets. He believed economic integration created dependency that could be weaponized. He was wrong. Canadian industries survived the pressure campaign while they restructured for reduced U.S. dependence permanently. Here's where it gets fascinating. Trump's pressure strategy was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of leverage dynamics. Trump assumed that Canada's economic integration with the United States created one-way dependency. He saw $718 billion in annual bilateral trade and concluded Canada needed American markets more than America needed Canadian supply. He calculated that geographic proximity eliminated Canada's alternatives. He believed that decades of cooperation had made Canada structurally unable to operate independently. Those assumptions drove his tariff strategy, imposed costs on Canadian industries, forced them to accept American terms, extract concessions through economic pain. The logic seemed straightforward, but that logic ignored critical asymmetries. Canadian steel and aluminum weren't luxury imports. They were inputs for American manufacturing. When tariffs raised the cost of Canadian steel, they raised the cost of American cars, appliances, and construction. American manufacturers absorbed those costs immediately. Their production became more expensive. Their exports became less competitive globally. Their profit margins shrank. Meanwhile, Canadian producers could redirect supply to other markets or serve protected domestic demand. The pain Trump intended for Canada landed primarily on American industries. Those tariffs also triggered retaliation that hit American exporters. Canada imposed dollar-for-dollar countermeasures targeting politically significant U.S. products. Bourbon faced tariffs. Orange juice faced tariffs. Steel products faced tariffs. These weren't random selections. They targeted products from states Trump needed politically. Kentucky bourbon producers lost Canadian market access. Florida orange juice exporters faced higher barriers. The retaliation was strategically calibrated to create domestic political pressure inside the United States. This creates a fascinating dynamic. Trump's tariffs raised costs for American manufacturers who depended on Canadian inputs. Canada's retaliatory tariffs raised costs for American exporters who depended on Canadian markets. American businesses faced pressure from both directions simultaneously. They lobbied Trump's administration repeatedly. They explained that integrated supply chains meant tariffs hurt American competitiveness first. They warned that uncertainty would delay investment. They predicted higher consumer prices. Those warnings were ignored because political theater was prioritized over economic reality. Meanwhile, Canada responded by accelerating diversification. The Canadian government expanded trade promotion to European and Asian markets. Export. Development Canada increased financing for non-US export deals. Infrastructure investments prioritized reducing dependence on American logistics networks. Domestic procurement policies shifted to favor Canadian suppliers. These weren't temporary crisis measures. These were permanent structural adjustments designed to reduce exposure to American political volatility. The U.S. Lumber Coalition and similar industry groups kept claiming American businesses supported Trump's tough approach to Canada. They're lying, or they're ignorant of what their own members were actually saying to policymakers. Ambassador Hillman confirmed that the U.S. business community was almost unanimous in opposing tariffs and supporting functional trade relationships with Canada. Corporate leaders understood immediately that confrontation would damage American competitiveness. They knew modern supply chains were fully integrated. They knew disruption would raise costs domestically. They warned policymakers explicitly. Those warnings were dismissed, and American industries became collateral damage in Trump's failed pressure campaign. The human cost of Trump's pressure campaign fell entirely on American workers and consumers, not Canadian industries. When steel tariffs raised input costs for American manufacturers, Those costs flowed directly through the economy. The American automotive industry uses roughly 15 million tons of steel annually. When tariffs added 25% to Canadian steel prices, that translated to billions in additional production costs. Car manufacturers couldn't absorb those costs entirely. They passed them to consumers through higher vehicle prices. The average new car price in the United States rose from approximately $36,000 in 2018 to over $40,000 by 2020. Tariffs weren't the only factor, but they contributed significantly. American families paid more for vehicles because Trump imposed tariffs on one of America's most reliable steel suppliers. Construction costs rose similarly. Residential and commercial building in the United States consumes roughly 40% of domestic steel supply. When steel prices climbed because of tariffs, construction costs increased proportionally. The National Association of Home Builders estimated that steel tariffs added approximately $1,000 to the cost of a typical new home. Combined with lumber costs and other material increases, housing affordability deteriorated. First-time homebuyers faced higher barriers. Rental construction slowed. The housing shortage worsened. American families paid the price for a pressure campaign designed to extract concessions from Canada. American exporters absorbed losses from Canadian retaliation. Kentucky bourbon producers saw Canadian sales decline sharply when retaliatory tariffs made their products more expensive. Canada is the largest export market for American bourbon. Exports to Canada dropped roughly 15% after retaliation hit. Distilleries reduced production. Workers faced reduced hours. Some facilities closed temporarily. Florida orange juice exporters faced similar pressure. Canadian tariffs made Florida juice less competitive against Brazilian imports. Market share declined. Revenue fell. The pain was concentrated in politically sensitive regions. Meanwhile, Canadian industries that survived the tariff period emerged strategically stronger. West Fraser, Canfor, Interfor, major Canadian producers restructured during the pressure campaign. They closed inefficient mills. They focused on modern high-efficiency operations. They diversified export markets beyond the United States. Government support programs helped cover transition costs. Export Development Canada expanded financing for European and Asian deals. Infrastructure investments improved port access for Pacific and Atlantic shipping. These companies didn't just survive Trump's pressure campaign, they used it as an opportunity to permanently reduce dependence on American market volatility. Ambassador Hillman confirmed that Canada's policy focus shifted fundamentally. Canada no longer assumes U.S. political stability is guaranteed. It prepares for volatility. It builds redundancy. It maintains autonomy. This isn't disengagement, it's strategic maturity. Canada still trades extensively with the United States because geography and integration make that economically rational. But Canada now designs policy assuming that American political decisions could become unpredictable or hostile at any time. That assumption drives infrastructure investment, trade diversification, domestic industry support, and regulatory independence. The irony is perfect. Trump imposed tariffs and threats to force Canadian compliance and extract concessions. He damaged American industries instead. Canadian businesses restructured to reduce U.S. market dependence. American manufacturers now face higher costs and reduced competitiveness. Canadian exporters now have diversified markets and reduced exposure to American political risk. Trump wanted leverage. He created permanent realignment. American businesses warned him explicitly that confronting Canada would backfire. Those warnings were ignored, and American workers, consumers, and exporters paid the price while Canada emerged more independent. The endgame is clear. Canada has permanently repositioned itself for reduced dependence on American political predictability. Ambassador Hillman stated explicitly that Canada will not return to the old model of automatic cooperation with the United States. This isn't disappointment. This is strategic realism. For decades, Canada designed policy assuming American political stability was essentially guaranteed. That assumption is gone. Trump's pressure campaign demonstrated that even America's closest allies could face unpredictable tariffs, hostile rhetoric, and weaponized economic policy at any time. Canada adjusted accordingly. This adjustment is permanent because it's institutionalized. Export Development Canada now prioritizes diversification metrics when evaluating financing. Infrastructure Canada factors reduced U.S. dependence into project approvals. Natural resources, Canada designs industry support programs, assuming American market access could be disrupted. These aren't temporary crisis responses. These are embedded policy frameworks that will guide Canadian decision-making for decades. The institutions that shape Canadian trade and industrial strategy now operate on the assumption that American political volatility is the baseline, not the exception. Canada's trade relationships reflect this shift. Canadian exports to the European Union have expanded significantly since 2018. The Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement provided framework. But Trump's tariffs provided motivation. Canadian businesses that might have been comfortable focusing on American markets alone now actively pursue European buyers. Asian markets similarly expanded. Canadian lumber exports to China grew. Energy exports to Asian markets increased. These relationships don't replace American trade volume entirely, but they reduce the percentage of Canadian exports dependent on US markets. That diversification is structural and permanent. Meanwhile, American industries face a situation where they damage their own competitiveness. Manufacturers that absorbed higher steel costs during the tariff period didn't regain those losses when tariffs were eventually suspended or modified. Construction companies that faced higher material costs passed them to consumers, reducing housing affordability permanently. Bourbon distilleries that lost Canadian market share didn't automatically regain it when retaliatory tariffs ended. Markets don't reverse cleanly, damage compounds. And the American economy absorbed costs that achieved no strategic benefit. The social consequences extend beyond economics. When Ambassador Hillman says Canada took the United States for granted, she's describing how Canada assumed American foreign policy would remain institutionally stable and predictable. That assumption shaped everything from defense coordination to environmental policy to border management. Trump's approach shattered that assumption. Canada now approaches every dimension of the relationship with contingency planning. What if American policy shifts overnight? What if treaties get questioned? What if cooperation gets weaponized? These questions now drive Canadian strategic planning permanently. Trump thought threatening Canada would pressure a smaller neighbor into compliance. He permanently reduced American influence instead. He made Canadian policy more independent, not more aligned. He made Canadian industries less dependent, not more vulnerable. He made Canadian institutions less trusting, not more cooperative. He made Canadian trade more diversified, not more concentrated. Canada paid short-term costs. Industries faced disruption. Workers faced uncertainty, exporters faced barriers. But Canada emerged from Trump's pressure campaign strategically stronger, more independent, more diversified, more resilient, more institutionally mature, and permanently positioned to operate in a North American relationship where automatic cooperation is replaced by conditional partnership based on mutual respect rather than assumed subordination. Trump paid no short-term cost, but the long-term cost is permanent reduction in American influence over one of its most important neighbors. The relationship Ambassador Hillman describes isn't one where Canada returns to automatic alignment. It's one where Canada maintains autonomy, builds alternatives, and designs policy assuming American decisions could become hostile at any moment. Trump wanted leverage. He created independence. Canada wins. America loses.